Brendon.
Hello.
Hey. So one of my favorite things in the process of making this show is try to find thematic connections between games you and I really like, but trying to see if there's any concrete reason for games that consistently rank high on like our game of the year list or whatever. Like, we've been doing the show podcast Into the Aether for 5.5 years, almost 6. It'll be 6 this summer, which is wild. But it's interesting because I feel like we started the show coming in at very different places in terms of our game experience.
Yeah.
A lot of the show has been you and I trying to kind of fill in our own personal gaps, like try to play games that we either like didn't grow up with or just missed, or genres we didn't really gravitate towards initially. And so it's cool to see like, okay, but what are the Stephen and Brendon games? Like I can always guess you're gonna love roguelites, and I usually gravitate towards RPGs. But what are the games that speak to both of us? And I've noticed that a lot of the games that you and I really like are games that add some type of mechanic to friendship, basically.
Yeah.
Games that take essentially a dating sim skeleton and mesh it with another game. The clearest example, of course, being the Persona series.
Yeah.
Literally being the power of friendship, the game, which I love so much. Persona obviously is the clear example there, but games like Fire Emblem Three Houses, Mass Effect, these are all games that make your connection with other people matter in terms of what the core gameplay is. So like in Persona, the better you get to know your friends and even people outside your party, that will unlock different abilities that will help you with the dungeon crawling and other parts of the game. Fire Emblem Three Houses is almost identical to that in many ways, and is kind of a natural evolution of the Fire Emblem support system, where units fighting alongside each other will grow closer and you'll get little support scenes, and maybe they'll get married. Maybe they'll have kids that travel from the future to help you out. Who knows?
Maybe they'll die in combat.
Maybe they'll perma-die.
I think that's actually like an important piece of adding those kinds of mechanics into Fire Emblem. I think Three Houses is really brilliant in deciding to incorporate that stuff on the level that they did with that game, because as soon as you start to like fall in love with, I don't mean like romantically, but I mean like as a player, start to fall in love with all of these characters and all of these people who are in your house and in your class. Like when it starts to get real in the back half of that game and they do start to just straight up die, it hits about 18 million times as hard as it would have if they hadn't gone all in on adding the like calendar system and the Persona stuff into Three Houses. I think that's one of the most brilliant aspects of that game.
You and I really like games that have the narrative interwoven with the gameplay mechanics. So I'm curious from your perspective, like as someone who hadn't previously gravitated towards RPGs, usually isn't like we both enjoy talking about game narrative, but like I don't think you're seeking that in the same way I am. What about these games kind of really works for you, and what do you think are maybe other potential examples of like adding mechanics to relationships or even just to narrative in general?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question, because I think it's worth highlighting where you and I differ, because you kind of framed it as like I'm like more of a roguelite person, you're more of an RPG person, and I think if you distill that down even further, I think one of the conclusions that you and I have come to over the years is like I think I'm much more mechanics focused and you're much more like narrative character focused, and yet this is the place where we both meet. That Three Houses example is kind of perfect in that way, because it mechanically adds to the narrative in that way. It is like the perfect meeting point of where you and I think align in terms of our tastes. And I think if you even zoom out and start to look at some other games, although Three Houses and Persona are more on your side of the fence, as it were, on my side of the fence is a game that you and I both loved and was our game of the year, which is Hades, which is literally a roguelite that has similar relationship building elements in it.
That's the exact fusion point between us.
Yeah,
sure.
I think so. It's a genre that I really gravitate towards, I think, more than you do, but incorporated all of these elements that you really like about RPGs and about these character build or these character growth moments, and using that stuff to make Zagreus's experience, I think, a little bit more like relatable, heartwarming, interesting, give him a stronger, more structural character arc is like a really brilliant choice for a game where you were dying over and over and over and over again. Having this group of people just like rooting you on alongside that, it's the kind of thing that will prevent people from bouncing. Like I grew up in the hardened minds of Spelunky, right? Like I grew up in the basement of Binding of Isaac. Like those are the games that I dumped like literally 1,000 hours each into when I was younger. And those games, like, you have to have a weird piece of your brain that's like, well, I know I'm just going to die for the first 200 hours and maybe I'll see the end one day. But something about Hades just adding this like extra layer of, there's a bunch of people who, you know, are, I think, reveling in the fact that you're dying and are also just trying to kill you straight up. But there are just as many people who are there to support you and cheer you on and hope that Zagreus makes it out, that I think is a thing that will bring so many more people into that genre. We just did an episode recently where we talked a whole bunch about Souls-likes, and we talked about how if you take the Souls-like genre or some of the trappings of the Souls-like genre and mash them up with another genre, you'll find ways of making Souls-likes more approachable to people who normally wouldn't have gotten into them. And I feel like the same is true of this like kind of blanket term of like friendship mechanics that we're talking about here, where you could take that and layer it onto Fire Emblem, and suddenly you have a much more compelling game than you would have had without it. Or you can take those mechanics and add them to a roguelike, and suddenly you have something like Hades that becomes Game of the Year across like pretty much every publication.
Yeah, I think with Hades, what really works too is like you don't have to engage with that side of it. Like we definitely did, but I think having that be kind of an option for the player, I think makes it more rewarding if you do seek it out. If you like, you can technically roll credits and never resolve one of the many lingering stories between like Dusa and the staff of the House of Hades, or
right.
like, you know, one of the many other gods and demigods. But I think also to your point about like these characters rooting you on, I think in many ways, I mean, you're literally advancing the story when you die. You're advancing the plot more by returning to the Hall of Hades than you are by getting to the surface in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. There are multiple runs where like, if I just knew that my combination of boons was like totally whack, I'd be like, well, if I'm gonna die, I'll see Skelly again and I'll get to talk to my friends.
Yeah.
And get to talk to Than and Meg and have a good time. Because the thing about a game like Persona or Mass Effect or Baldur's Gate 3, which also comes to mind, is like they're really good characters. Like you can't just make those, like if you don't like the characters, you're not going to want to engage in those mechanics, which is silly to say, but like it's really like if you don't like the cast of a Persona game, you're not going to engage with any part of it.
Yeah.
So I think that Hades was definitely a bit of a flex where like they were great characters, but they also let you seek them out. And I think that option too, I think one of the reasons why I like games where you can like have these relationship meters and have potential romance, or just like the game is mechanically keeping count of like who you choose to spend time with on any level, is it adds to the role playing, it adds to the authorship of the story. And I think it makes like your adventure that much more personal. Like, oh, like it goes back to like, this is maybe a weird connection, but it goes back to the Pokemon days of like, oh, who's on your team? Like, I just love talking to people about what their experience with the game was like.
Yeah. And
seeing where it differed and seeing like who they chose to invest in and what happened because of it. I mean, I think the Fire Emblem connection to Pokemon is there, so maybe it's not too off track, but yeah, and in terms of what can happen in the future, like the word for this is dating sim, but I think the reason why we're like veering towards like relationship mechanics or friendship is because it doesn't have to be romantic. You know, I think the skeleton of all of this is Tokimeki Memorial, which is like kind of proof that you can actually just make relationships into numbers and have that be like a casino slot machine of like just like nightmare teen angst dialogue going wrong every day.
God, that game is so good.
It is, and I think playing that really opened my eyes to one, its influence on Persona. Like you play that game and then you play any, you know, Persona 3, 4, or 5, and it's like, oh my god.
Yeah, it's like somebody took you into like the foundation basement of a skyscraper of like every game you've ever loved, and it's like, oh, this is the load-bearing pillar at the bottom of this entire structure, actually, is Tokimeki Memorial. It's one PS1 disc at the bottom of this big skyscraper.
But I do think like, and we've talked about this on the show. Actually, I think we talked about this when we talked about Tokimeki Memorial. But I think like when you say dating sim, there's still kind of a stigma around that. There's still an association with that isn't great. All these games we mentioned, taking that formula and meshing it with other genres and seeing what can happen with it, and like moving past just like here are all these characters. Who do you want to romance? That doesn't have to be the goal.
Yeah. I feel like also if you just like zoom out a little bit from the video game aspect of it, I feel like there's this feeling I have about games that incorporate these kinds of mechanics in particular and are like asking you to become invested in characters on this level, both mechanically, but also just like narratively. That reminds me so much of the people who will like watch and rewatch a certain TV show over and over again because they're like, these characters are my friends. I love them. And it's because you've spent, 50, 100, 200 hours with them. And that is an experience that video games are frequently, I think, demanding of their players, right? Is like, you're playing a Final Fantasy game, you're going to play that for like 70, 80 hours. You're playing, Fire Emblem Three Houses, I think is another great example here where it's like, you're going to finish that game and probably want to check out the other two houses when you're done with your first run of that game. There's a reason that people even talk about that game in terms of quote unquote runs at all, is because you want to experience it from all the different angles. And by the time you're done with that, and you've experimented so much with the different characters who are going to be in your houses, you're going to know so much about all of them, and you are going to feel sad almost when it's gone and that experience is over. And the same thing, I know the same thing is true for you with Baldur's Gate 3, having played that game more than once at this point already. Like, this is just, I think, an inherent piece of the medium that allows for something like this to hit so much harder than it would if it was a much shorter experience. I think obviously a movie being 2.5 hours or something, you can still feel a lot about a character by the time that's done. You can watch that movie over and over and over again. But I think there's something inherent to the idea of like, I'm making the decisions about how this relationship forms, and I'm calling the shots when it comes to dialogue options and who I'm spending time with. That is mimicking real life in a major way. It's like in real life, you meet somebody for the first time, you don't immediately click and become like the deepest, closest friends of all time. But like the second or third time you meet that person, you'll probably get closer to that. And then fourth and fifth time and onwards. And that is literally,
if you give them enough duck mayonnaise, they'll eventually want to marry you.
Exactly.
That's what I've learned from Stardew Valley.
Right.
But I mean, I think you're right. Cause like the thing I was also thinking about is that these types of mechanics, gamifying relationships, we'll say, it's become the expectation in a lot of ways, in a way that like I know I'm going a bit all over the place. When we talk about like open world games and like what's the expectation, I think overall more and more people are expecting and wanting interaction and meaning behind everything in a game. So if it's an open world game, that means like, okay, I don't want to just be able to go to that mountain in the distance. I want to know what's in there. Why am I going there? Who lives inside of it? Like, what's the purpose of this mountain? Can I blow up the mountain and build a house out of it? Like, these are obviously like, not every game is going to do all this stuff, but I think like in a post Minecraft world, I do think that that's like the desire in a way that maybe it wasn't before. Maybe it used to be exciting enough to just be able to go somewhere in the distance, but now I think there needs to be meaning behind it. In the same way that now, like when you meet a character, it's like, well, like, can I team up with them? Can I betray this character? I think it's interesting that when we call certain games immersive sims, everything in the world sort of exists, and there are some, foreseen possibilities by the developers, but they're leaving a lot of these things in the game to allow players to be creative and just to see kind of what happens. But I think that can also extend to things beyond just combat, like I said before. So in a world where Baldur's Gate 3 wins Game of the Year across the board, I think that speaks volumes to like how people see games and what the possibilities are in terms of character-driven stories.
Yeah, there's no easy way to segue into this, but I just need to shout out the Yakuza Like a Dragon franchise. Man, those games are so good at just making you spend like hundreds of hours with like 5 characters who will make you jump out of your seat every time they show up on screen. Like, I just can't stop thinking about seeing Majima show up on screen and like losing my mind, And we get a different side of them too,
I think when we spend time with characters in the world of Yakuza, outside of the main story, it's usually very different, but it's still like believably them. I also love the idea, like whenever we're not sure how to end an episode, just bring up Yakuza. It will probably connect in some way,
Hey, Infinite Wealth is available on all platforms. That's actually not even true. I think we should wrap this one up.
If you need a mascot for making mechanics out of friendship, Ichiban.
Ichiban.
Thanks for everything, Ichiban.
Yeah. All right. Hey, talk to you later, everybody. Bye-bye.
See ya.